Um, My name is Leah Bobet. I am a poet, novelist, and climate fiction editor whose work has won a decent amount of stuff in Canada and internationally. I am also a trained sociolinguist, a historian, and someone with disability. I've worked as a copywriter, communication strategist, a bookseller, and a Hansard reporter who had a close-up view of legislative processes, which will explain some of the perspectives here. And I'm an organizer. I've worked for about 20 years on and off with community level climate and capacity building projects where I live in downtown Toronto, doing urban gleaning, teaching deputation trainings, recruiting volunteers for frontline emergency street outreach projects that sort of like assemble and disassemble as necessary. My longest term gig right now is the Chili project over here, which this was our earliest and best piece of media. It is a small grassroots community network that has delivered over 30,000 community sourced hot meals for unhoused and underhoused people in the neighborhood through a drop-in called Seeds of Hope. We started in 2021. It was a pandemic emergency response. We're probably, unfortunately, going to be going for the long haul, so it's faster, smarter, better at this point. I'm currently also assembling early frameworks for small urban orchards. So as an organizer, I'm a bit of a switch hitter. I run a lot of assists on other people's projects, sometimes short, sometimes years long, basically trying to make connections between ideas and clusters of advocacy. Or in other words, I am a contributing member of an ecology of community work. And my role in each of those processes and niches is going to be different every single time. That's the environment where a lot of these observations and strategies grew, and something of the assumptions and worldviews they rest upon. So basically, experientially, those are my relations. Conceptually, these are my relations. On the slide, it did. Here are some of the knowledges they rest upon. I'm very likely going to touch ground other presenters have discussed this week because I think we're agreeing very enthusiastically on a lot of things and also diverging in some very informative ways. This has been a really interesting experience, seeing so many people land on common ground from so many starting points. I hope there's something in this approach that contributes to that. I do want to say up front, I know time's been a little wonky, but I want to leave some solid time for discussion at the end. So if you do think of something you want to bounce around the room, like grab it for them. But if I use a term that you're not familiar with, stick your hand, please. I can't entirely take all the terms of art out of my voice, but I don't want to lose people and like leave you in the pit. So please just holler and I'll break it down. Like just at me. Okay, story time. Well, I've had a very long relationship with climate action or interventions that work through a climate lens. Here's where my work with climate work starts. A few months before COVID, the publisher at Reckoning, where I had a poem in the 2019 issue, offered me the chance to edit poetry for the 2020 volume. The fiction editor, Cecile Cristofari, was looking at centering it around the beauty of our relationship with the world around us now, a deep rooting in what we were fighting for. It was an approach to writing about climate that, yeah, I wanted in on. And it rhymed with the best advice about activism and organizing that I have ever heard to date, from Dr. Winnie Ng, who is a labor organizer and scholar in Toronto, that you can work from range, but that's the kind of fuel that burns you to a crisp. If you work from joy or love, you can sustain your work and yourself. So COVID hit just about at the beginning of our submissions period. So I started reading for this journal, locked in a one-bedroom high-rise apartment in the middle of a downtown where the sidewalks are still not wide enough to socially distance. I spent a lot of time reading poetry. We were fortunate and proactive enough in our submission strategy. And I'm not leaving out that proactivity because doing the footwork is how you get a diverse table of contents for real. To get submissions from every inhabited continent on Earth. So it started to be possible to see people describing, reflecting on, and strategizing the ways climate showed up for them regionally, while holding that same spectrum of emotions: fear, fatigue, stubbornness, affection, solidarity, wonder, and love. Reckoning's a very collective journal to start with. It's run mostly like an editorial group might. And the role of section editor involves, you do have a bit of the last word, like I could veto things. But there's a lot of courteous listening and respect for the real multiplicity of expertise everyone brings to the table. We quickly figured out how to be generous with our reads on things, and honest when we thought maybe someone had a better perspective on how to read a particular submission well. Our team came from the speculative world, from the literary world, from a few different first languages, look back to that, and about 7 time zones. We learned to take decisions flexibly and steadily because the publisher's in Michigan, my co-editor lives in Provence, and the editorial members reading poetry with me were in Mumbai, Victoria, Austin, Texas, Stockholm, Sweden. And there's 2 people I cannot legitimately even say for sure because they are habitually really nomadic and I can't remember where they were that summer. Half of that poetry sub-team spoke English as a second or third language. And when we put together our perspectives on how words worked from that experience, just heaped it all together, we became vastly more than the sum of our parts. We were doing really nourishing work in a really nourishing way in a really terrible year. And we all needed it very badly. And so it's not surprising that that journal, and this is a micro press, Mike DeLuca runs Reckoning Press out of his back shed in Burrell, Michigan. There's not much funding. There's even less officialdom happening. This won a lot of awards. We got 5 or 6 Utopia awards. We had a wonderful author who's based in Nigeria on the list for the Penn Robert J. Dow Emerging Writer Award. We blew our minds because Penn noticed us. I mean, okay, we were surprised, what, right? But this was a container built of so much good process, so much faith in our fellow human beings internally and externally, that in retrospect, I'm not actually surprised that this resonated when we kicked it out into the world. This is a small model of a way it is possible to work. It wasn't entirely outside my own experience. There was a lot of overlapping principle with some of how I've run other projects. And I'm not going to pretend the slightest that we did not get on each other's toes ever. But the context, the goals, what we were saying, and how we invited other people in lined up together. What we said equaled how we moved, and that showed in the results. So these are the kinetics I bring into my second major climate editorial gig in the past few years. Being a member of the reading team for Grist's Imagine 2200 contest in summer 2022. That's a lot of twos. The brief for Imagine 2200 bit is to write stories set in positive but earned climate futures. There's a special rider on that year about rooting those stories in living cultural practice. So some work had been done in the guidelines around a diverse slush poem. Our 4-person reading team, who were all speculative fiction people, and some of whom are also active organizers as well, winnowed down a fairly international submissions pile to create a shortlist for the 3-person judging panel. And we did not get the same we did not get the same kinds of stories. And that was interesting because we had some real overlapping ground rules. Positive climate fiction, well written, diverse, no eco-fascism, which is a hard rule in every climate fiction slush pile I have ever worked with. It's not even my rule, it's just nobody wants to do that. But the stories I read for the Imagine 2200 contest were angrier and narrower. Yes.
What is eco-fascism?
Eco-fascism is the kind of approach where everything is terrible, therefore we need to become more authoritarian in order to meet that challenge. It's like, because it's the ideology that a climate emergency means that it is now justified to knock people over the head, genocide them, take away their rights, etc. So yes, good. Thank you for asking. I appreciate it. Where was we? Yes. These stories are angrier and narrower in their version of hope. They could not always understand the value of certain places or certain lives. They were very trauma marked. And they're carrying revenge. Some of them, and these are the ones that actually really hurt me to read, could only conceive of hope as escape from desperate and oppressive circumstances, like full flight into the night. I wasn't sure those stories really knew where they were running to. There was a stronger strain of needing to make sure people learned the right lessons in that batch of stories. They were, in short, more hungry, reactive, and violent. And this was a psychological snapshot of both a time and a process. There are a few things that happened to shape those experiences. And I'm not going to do a full, dissection because this isn't really a publishing talk and that would probably bore you. But the takeaway is about how those projects moved. You find the footprints of what response you're going to get from people and a call for submission. Submission guidelines are, I don't think they're thought of this way, but they're a call and response scenario. You know kind of what you want to see, but you don't want to hem it in too much. And you're standing there writing out the rules and you're Marco, right? And you're hoping you're going to get polo back. And sometimes what you get is cheese and you're like, no, not cheese. And sometimes what you get is capybara and you're like, that's interesting, actually. I didn't ask for that. But you're trying to, like, this is, if we want to take it into linguistics, it's an elicitation exercise almost, but for fiction, for narrative. So how the guidelines were structured, it was a big deal. How open they were or how rigid they were. How accessible the editorial team was or appeared to be for submitters. Even if you are accessible, the appearance of inaccessibility shuts you right down, because if people don't believe they could just email you and answer that question, it still won't happen. It had a lot to do with the difference in audience for those publications, because smallish literary journals run by nerds bring out a totally different crowd than contests with four-figure prizes backed by media companies. I think the previous speaker mentioned Grist. Grist runs Imagine 2200. The stakes are going to be different when it's like, here's our literary journal, and when someone's like, we will give you 4,000 American dollars for a good story. That's a lot of groceries for a lot of people. It had to do with geography. It's been, to put it mildly, a rough decade in the United States. And this was a mostly American team and an American company. So American political currents were going to inflect that project, not deliberately, but in terms of how people are reading that day because of what they're reacting to. We did that reading in the summer where all the Roe versus Wade rollbacks happened. Most of the team was femme-bodied, if not femme-identified. We were for shit that week, let's put it that way. And that inflected how we read. And this was also going to inflect how international fiction writers would relate to the project, because the dynamics of nations, when you run something in the United States and people from the rest of the world are interacting with it, there's a whole lot of sort of subtext and baggage comes with it. It also had to do with the difference between a new and temporary team being formed for 3 months, contract employees, and a more international and much looser project team that had existed and formed some of its culture pre-pandemic, and where people could like stay or go or scale up or scale down or contribute in different ways over the span of years. These are all questions of operational structure that are going to come in later, and they're portable for interventions. We'll get back to that. Sheldon. Here's why I'm telling you this. It was a very clear framing of how we parse a very open concept like climate hope. We all experience hope or its absence. It symbolizes something to almost everyone. So we use it to ostensibly bind our communities together. But everyone who says hope has an ocean of personal and extremely specific meanings in mind. So what they're doing is, when you say it, they're watching your hands for your social cues. It's not what you've said, but it's how you've said it. And reckoning by design or by accident, we pulled off a really interesting experiment. We constructed a container and a process that focused the question of climate communication on a generative method. How we wrote the guidelines, how we engaged writers, made ourselves available, showed visible and fairly transparent occasionally decision-making, spoke in a register of how we cared, how we did things. how that care and practice manifested in different geographic, cultural, subcultural contexts. Those were the cues we threw out, as we care about how people took our cues. Grist is an advocacy publication. It's a big and movement publication. It's been really celebrated for that. And its audience values advocacy rhetoric. The clear underlying goal of that publication doing Let's Write climate fiction is about advocacy and or convincing other people to do things. That's a why. Why should you care about this? Why should you take certain actions? So on the surface, these projects resemble, but their kinesthetics, their stride, their proprioception, so the way they physically perceive space, did the talking. They're fundamentally different conversations, how and why. So to dip back into sociolinguistic terms again, we are centering these communicative acts on a perceived in-group and a perceived out-group, respectively. There's no way you get the same response, same stories, the same truths, or the same ideas about what communication is, doing, using the same symbol to hit a target that different. So I want to slide into this through considering sort of what the lesson of that was, the messages of bodies and processes and design mechanics. How we communicate is, invisibly, not the things that come out of our mouth, is shaping what we communicate. What game design people call ludonarrative dissonance, which is the gap between what the video game lets you physically do and what it tells you with its mouth. This is game development theory, but it's also organizing theory. Pull in Alec Mukherjee, who served on the Toronto Police Services Board about a dozen years ago, and has rather famously pointed out locally that when you want to know what a system is actually about, you don't look at what it says, you look at how it moves. So let's dig into a little bit of that. Oh no, there's no audio. Yeah. It's okay, we're gonna let the joke go. No, we're gonna stand up and the joke has died on its ass and we're just gonna let it go. That is our good friend's broken social scene saying, okay, listen up. Today we're gonna talk about fear. So fear does funny ass shit to what we assume is happening. What we assume about other people's understandings and what we assume needs to be done about it. We can strategize those as separate pieces when we're designing a communication or an action, but let's take it down to the source. This is largely about if fear is the gene, it expresses itself in a lot of different ways. A lot of what we discuss as climate anxiety is fundamentally people build little receptacles for fear in a culture where we're just not really very good at admitting we're afraid. And we're not very kind when someone around us admits we're afraid. It's kind of discouraged to say to other people, oh God, I am so scared. Or to invite other people into these strange angles and very organic schedules of grief. I don't think this is necessarily for bad and malicious reasons. It is kind of a form of overwhelm that people wall off because they can't do anything about it, they can't ease it, and it hurts. We're social animals. Feelings are incredibly contagious. So especially in spaces where we need or want to be taken seriously, or we're on broadcast like social media, which I think is seriously, frankly, overrepresented in our notion of how people talk climate, there is a cultural response to distance or cloak fear and diminished capacity. And this is the major tactic a lot of people use when they aren't really handling their own emotional landscape, or they don't trust people around them to meet them generatively and empathetically. Projecting. What is meant about the self is said about the world. This can be as simple as saying, well, I think we need a moment. No, actually what you mean, and we know what you mean, is you need a moment, but you're trying to diffuse that softly by, it's like distributed responsibility. We're all looking for the guy who did this, right? On the bigger end, saying it's impossible. You can at least pretend what you're doing is analysis or authority over the problem, or at least you feel like you're standing in a place of some power compared to I don't know what to do. And this isn't really something, this is not something people are making up. They're not doing this for no reason. There are a lot of competing narratives about, our happy little polycrisis going on right now. And every single one of those narratives is unfortunately recruiting aggressively. The admission that someone is uncertain, afraid, or not in control tends to draw out a somewhat predatory reaction that we call in business nudge marketing. In religion, we call it proselytizing. In culture, we call it influencing. These are all transactional responses. Oh, you're weak, let me eat. There is a level on which I think people can think by doing that they are doing something good. I won't speak to motives because that's not my headspace. But on the personal level, it can be seen as an almost resource extraction model of other people's pain. The message isn't consideration or care for the well-being of that whole person. It's that people in pain constitute potential political power and labor that can and should be harvested. That impacts how we express fear and pain. We only speak it, many of us, outside intimate relationships in translation. Doing those translations is actually one of the sort of secret core skills of being both an artist and an organizer, because a large chunk of your efficacy relies on being able to suss out what someone's actually saying underneath the words and respond to what someone actually might have meant. And right now we are speaking in climate communication to tired, stressed, fallible people. There's a great line from a US Supreme Court decision on the death penalty, which I was researching for a novel project. Diverse human frailties. That stuck with me for miles. It's a dandelion seed view of humanity. Everyone, beautiful, both available to both love and harm. So if we take these statements untranslated, left home, if we take defense mechanisms for a hostile social ecology and think that's what people meant, we are going to completely talk past each other as fears and concerns are read as dismissal and aggression. The people voicing those fears in these sort of narrow ways they feel safe to do so or know how to go unmet, unmirrored, and feel more and more adrift. Everyone gets more hostility, isolation, and fortress mentality. And so when we're digging into how we talk about climate, this stuff has definitely weirded how we talk about climate, the thing that scares us. Because it is a super wicked problem. By and large, none of us have pat answers about what to do. Oh, right, yes. That's from the Banner Saga. The Banner Saga is a lovely game about responsibility. Serious, it's brilliant. But we're grounding in the body right now. Yeah, see, thank you. Hal Johnson and Joanne. These are actions and structures speak before we're actually verbally speaking. And this for me is the building block of communicating climate. We aren't talking to enemy soldiers. We aren't talking to persuadables or symbolic representations of a political bloc who have, this measurement of their head and they are this tall and they like that cheese. We are talking to a human being. There are a whole lot of arguments and counter-arguments that just vanish, a whole lot of strategies and rules and trainings that become immediately less relevant if we're able to center that understanding in our living practices. That person is a person, whole and entire. If you want a citation, Martin Buber, ich and du, I and thou. It's translated from the German, but that is worth the drive. And I can go back for that later. But after the past few days of talks, I don't think I actually need to, and I bluntly kind of love that for us. So we skip ahead to the slightly more important derivation. Talking to a human being means that at all times, what we're actually talking to is a parasympathetic nervous system. Yeah. I did the same thing. I was like, neurology is a weird situation. It lives in a peculiar place, kind of inside and outside time. And I must stress, some of this is science, some of this is cultural process from a few places, some of this is practical politics, and some of this is poetry. I can fill in blanks later. But our nervous systems run through our whole bodies. There's spine and branches and roots and brainstem. And a lot of what our nervous system is great at is they're great analogizers. It's very deeply visible in how we navigate the world. When we're uncertain or in danger, we have these very classic mixtures of fight, flight, fawn, freeze, which we roll out depending kind of on what's worked for us before. And bluntly, if I say something to you here that brings up a memory that put you in that place, nothing I say or do in the next few minutes will supersede that memory. The conversation will 100% be in the hands of that remembered moment. It'll be a different year for you than it is for me for a few minutes. And then the year will come back. And that's not right or wrong, that's just life in a body. We've talked a bit about storying the past few days, so I think let's flip it to this. Bodies and their ways of analogizing situations are poets. When they encounter an idea or an experience, they go out looking for what they've already seen that rhymes. This is not just interpersonal. This is a feature of our broad social narratives. Fears and countermeasures live as structures in our wider social bodies in a way that a few talks have touched upon this week. The Jeremiah one was like bang on this. Broader social trauma responses can become very visible if you're positioned in at a certain juncture from generational trauma specifically. The point where countermeasures and habits that a real situation created have sort of come loose from the present and active threat and just kind of gone in as how we do the thing. My parents hoard food. Pre-pandemic, my parents hoarded food. It's wild. Their parents were either starved or deliberately starved by very unfriendly governments and armies. They don't consciously hoard food. This is just the reflex. Their habit of living, if anyone's familiar with missing stair theory? Missing stair theory? Okay, that's nerd stuff. Okay, we don't think about it. But their habit of living assumes that there is a stair that is broken and you should always skip over that stair when you're walking up and down. This will carry over even when you're living on a staircase that works. And if an individual, like if you can start seeing how people do this, you start seeing it in a lot of places. And this is a fairly constructive way to start to consider climate or other kind of doom narratives to a certain extent. Society's trauma memories, structural ghost stories. Societies collapse and people survive that. And then they carry that experience. And we make myths with how we did the countermeasures. And myths are amazingly durable because they are our communal and collective rhymes. So that brings us a little back to the question of making climate stories. Having thought about that process neurologically, how do we move that process a little? How do we contribute some rhymes maybe? Oh, sorry, that was actually. Did I have my slide notes? No, this is fine. So insofar as stories work on us, and I'm saying that not as generate an effect, but get, work like you work a muscle. This is why. That rhyme, I did mess something up. Whoa, no. Anyways, okay, this is right. We're gonna dig into the rhyme a bit. This is a bit just a motion of crisis thing. So here's our little rhyming thing. When we encounter a novel situation, the first thing we do is rifle through our proverbial cognitive kitchen drawer. Every strategy we have, looking for something we can draw the analogy to. This is what? Because if you can figure out what it's like, you can figure out in the moment of crisis when you don't actually have access to a lot of your brain functions because a bunch of your brain shuts down. Which already learned strategy to adapt or use. And this is a method. We don't think about it as method because it's working on the level of the body. And so that's quite automatic for a lot of people. This has some strange side effects. We can find ourselves time traveling a bit, starting to act the age at which we learned the particular strategy we're employing. And a lot of how people think about trauma from the outside is how this shows when people look like they're misreacting to a problem. Because what they're doing is they've pulled an analogy out of the drawer that would fit for another time. It rhymed, but it was not necessarily a total rhyme. And now it's what did you do? Sorry, I did mess up slides. But this is the thing climate artists actually can be good for. Drawing metaphor connections so people can preload sort of what is a thing like. We can fill the drawer a little. And potentially have some grease on that process of, okay, we're in a crisis. What is our analogy? What is our strategy? when we're in problems. The metaphors help us rough sort. They help us establish a framework that is beginning. I'll pull out a Japanese word, yutori, which is a concept of moving in ways that create ease for you later. The best gloss I can find is living with spaciousness. So when we're taking time through doing climate art to build some analogies, we're kind of holding space for ourselves. But this only really works if the problem is like something. If none of those options check out, when you get to the bottom of the strategies and there is no result, that's frequently when people panic. The faster people panic, the faster they have run through their store of available tool sets or available capacity for fear. And that's the sharp limitation. Art is in many ways a preparation or sometimes a protective factor, but it is simultaneously kind of is and isn't doing any work about the problem. Or to reframe, it's an incredibly important skill to understand where's the switching point between story making, preparing by analogy, and just getting in there with your hands. Execution, basically. It's only part of a cycle. So this is the major disadvantage, I think, of climate art, and where it's not doing any work about the problem. It's sort of a one-way situation. At worst, it's a crutch. It corrects the feeling, not the active situation on the ground, because the right tool for a situation is frequently an action. And since art runs on our parasympathetic nervous systems, those context-bound things, which kind of live in different ears depending on what they're remembering, sometimes the results you get when someone is reading climate art will be mediated and sometimes destroyed by that person's relationship to context. So it's unfortunately a bit lossy. You can't actually do a straight communication. You're chucking something into the private ecology of someone's head and sort of hoping you get a result. But a worthwhile place to settle is that telling climate stories is sort of a proxy mechanism for play. We can pretend something's happening, kind of run the idea on our nervous systems without risking our actual bodies. The story mechanism as a whole, what we do when we do story, is putting complex, difficult, or dangerous things at a safer move or modeling a scenario outside time, which is what we do when we rehearse a conversation we are dreading having. We are modeling a scenario outside time. There's a lovely quote in Don's talk yesterday about the rather gently protective function of denial. Sometimes this is keeping us safe until we're ready for. Climate story doesn't guarantee the choice of your strategy. It does not guarantee that even if someone chooses your strategy, where this is, sorry, I will get mildly snitty because this is one of the things that drives me nuts. If someone cares enough, this does not guarantee competence in execution. There's lots of things I care about. I'm still crap at them. We're not like loading a program out of the person's body and double-clicking. It just lets us sort of metaphorically like lick the idea without getting poison in our mouths. So if we stick with thinking in bodies, in motion, what are we kind of doing there? I've found this to be true over and over. What can't you do when you're scared? What can't you be really, really, truly afraid while you're doing it? Fear and play are so foundationally, like mutually exclusive, that play is a force. So what's play? Play is our oldest learning strategy. If you think about the earlier model of emptying the drawers for a tool set to use on a problem, it's what happens when the drawer is empty if we don't panic. We have a memory in our bodies of the moment we don't know what to do, and it's like, and that's panic. We have another memory in our bodies of an unpredictable world with insufficient tool sets whose consequence might hurt us, or we have to sort of build everything from scratch, and that's called being a toddler. How did we learn the world? We licked it. We put it in our mouths. We played. So play is one of the highest forms of experiential learning, which is from a study on early childhood education, which talks a lot about this. It's a place we're thrown back to when we find ourselves surrounded by situations that are so thoroughly beyond our understanding, but it's also really productive. We're attempting to establish kind of a form of relations with a person, a concept, a system. Touch, sight, sound, taste, smell. What does it do when you poke it? We get curious, we figure out its properties and its limits, and that's relations we're establishing. This is where it might be worthwhile to send a poet, haha joke. I don't actually know what it's like to live in a brain that isn't trained for this kind of foolishness every day. I'm actually really curious what that looks like in other people's brains, but my brain routinely hands me incredibly important stuff in half symbolic, unexplained ways and walks away just leaving that steaming in my hands. And then I have to figure out what it means. How to bite that concept to attain any understanding of what the back of my head just said. But I know it did its thinking, so it's probably true. I just have to find my own way. And play is the strategy that works with that for me. So I think maybe the interesting way we can describe play is a controlled choice to leave the map, whatever your extant map may be. And fortunately, play is also the common tongue. All generations understand it, all cultures understand it, not one sentient mammal, dogs, dolphins, cats, whatever, is without play. That said, play is also interesting in that it can't really be coerced in any fashion, which is kind of fascinating and important for figuring out a thing. I mean, try it. At worst, you get culture wars. At best, you get workplace icebreakers and the idea of mandatory fun, which does not have the best reputation. I think a lot of us can think of gritting our teeth through something that's supposed to be team building. Oh God. People are not indifferent to fake play, is what I'm saying. We have big opinions on what good play is, and we seem to feel that it's better when it's spontaneous. You can't even really instruct people into play on certain levels, or play born from instruction like loses things. ECE thinks about this. They have 3 broad descriptive categories for play. Free play, which is like what's happening at the beginning of a Stephen King novel before you find the body in the woods. You are left to do your own thing. Guided play, which has some adult intervention. The thing that we get all bristly about is called intentional teaching through play. So that's stories with morals that break the fourth wall as they tell you what the moral of the story was. The Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits are intentional teaching through play. That's why the Outer Limits gets snarked on so bad, because it's annoying. I was at a fun little webinar a few weeks back about designing natural instead of artificial playgrounds of all things, placemaking in urban parks specifically. And designer Adam Bynenstock said something really interesting about how solid memory formation, especially in childhood, like when you get a really vivid memory of something, it's usually you had 5 sense engagement in that moment. The more detachment, the less you retain of it. The more fakery, the less impact. So there are a lot of arguments for the freer we can make our play, the better we live. So if we think as adults, this also seems to be true for most of our meaningful parasympathetic experiences. Think about someone trying to teach you how to meditate. Like, it's basically that thing. You kind of have to go, you have to be in there a bit. What I'm going to focus on a bit right now is adult play, because there's a whole lot happening in terms of how we parent or interact with children around climate. And people this week have said in no uncertain terms that being raised with that expectation has been an incredible fucking burden. So getting into and supporting adult play, I think people perceive it as like intimidating or harder, but it's possible and it's doable. So we're going to kind of quickly dig into that. It spreads me, potty hard spirit, adult play. I think it's important to highlight with adult play, if you're not used to like your brain sort of like farting out revelations and being like, dig your way out, you know, I know you had plans tonight, but too bad. Free play that is age appropriate for adults can be a bit of a learning curve. One of the major mistakes I think we make in designing climate interventions that are kind of thinking in play is gearing them to a child's level. Because that's our last idea of when you don't know how to work something we think is basic. It's being a child. We infantilize people brutally. I think that's part of why climate education on the whole, it can be very child heavy. We understand, you know, that we have a responsibility to teach children. We have processes for that. So climate instruction can kind of end up in these corners sometimes. We're speaking to grown-ass adults, like They need to do a craft activity like they're 5 because we've equated inexperienced to child. But however, I'm 37, I'm not old. No, we're still not children though. And the gap between the physical kind of pedagogy of that introductory work and the actual reality of how old the people in your room is can really like put people off. There is a model for this in fiction actually for people who are interested. It's called high-low publishing. It's a whole stream of books that are written to say a grade 3 reading level, for example, but with grade 8 content to keep the interest of readers who are grade 8 years old, but whose literacy skills aren't quite there. Because if you give reluctant readers something that's for babies, they're going to put it down and wander off. This is a portable concept. So I've got a few notable structures for adult play. And I'm going to probably hustle through this bit. That's some time there. There's a lot of good structure to be had in thinking about adult play in terms of stand-up comedy. We recognize that as adult play. Main rule of improv is yes, and you have to not throw at the other performer's premises, and that's why it's fun. Another actually kind of finds its way out in design thinking. So this first quote is Cory Doctorow's wonderful essay on Slack. The second is Kat Hicks, who is a psychologist studying software teams and is a wonderful Mastodon follow. And this is both examples of adults describing play processes, sort of surfacing in adult situations. Halting, difficult, but clearly emerging is like that's people doing play. There's a reason things like the Church of the Subgenius or Flying Spaghetti Monster are also set apart spaces for adult play. Those jokes are built possibly as religions for a reason. It's taking the concept of carving off space for different rules and being silly and sort of knocking on that door. So carving out dedicated space can be one way we shift into adult play. That's a D&D tabletop game. That's a yoga class. That's some versions of religious spaces. That is one of the functions of a pride parade. And in some cultures, that is going down to the pub for a pint. That's set apart space for playtime. So there is a possible intervention in carving out dedicated climate space, but we think about climate in every part of our lives. So I want to really look at play as a lens, like an equity lens. Beer goggles for fun. Best model of process, my best analogy so far for bringing that kind of adult experimentation in systematically comes from prison industrial complex abolition, which is a large and generations long movement to reduce and replace prison systems just right out of our society. And the approach is taken in some ways very intuitive to my eye. If the situation says we can't stop having prisons because people do violence, it asks, okay, why do people do violence? What's going on there? And can we do something different about those factors so there's better options involved and violence doesn't come to the table? In short, and this is very short, your response to "but I can't" in an abolitionist mindset is under what conditions can I? It's yes and. And most of the work of an organizer is to help build those conditions, frequently through experimentation and frequently by poking something to see what it actually does. In short, it recasts advocacy, not necessarily as soldiers, persuaders, analysts, etc., but builders of a kinder and more functional infrastructure, or community scientists. There's a lot to derive from this for climate work, or in fact, any other long-term work. Mariam Kaba is the first name I will point you at if you're interested in following this up. There's some quotes I'm going to skip here because time is a thing. But looked at through an abolitionist lens, Sean Connery, systemic climate play can be when people feel unselfconscious, curious, and empowered enough to imagine the conditions where they can, but then go poke the problem in a pragmatic way. This is not a fantasist imagination, this is a pragmatic imagination. It's lick it, which translates to kind of looking at their own local version of a climate problem and starting to sort of jam on it, right or wrong. So this may sound horrifying as a sentence in the way that maybe parents of small children are having a reaction to. Don't touch the disaster, stop poking that. But it's more than a little necessary. And I think creating the conditions Some of this boils down to, as organizers and as people, how we carry the body in social situations and when we are doing. So this is where the container that Say Reckoning built comes in. How did we carry the body? Oh, wow, that's some interesting capitalization. Okay. First one, raise capacity, not awareness. I am going on record as saying that I think awareness is bullshit. Everyone's aware, thank you very much. They just do not agree with you or me, and they do not have the same reading. And saying that people who disagree with us are unaware verges on passive aggressive. So I stepped away from that for good. They just have a different reading of the problem. But raising capacity has all kinds of good stuff at the end of the road. In short, this is taking approaches where we find ways not to activate the parasympathetic nervous system against perceived threat. We're not trying to hijack fight, flight, fawn. See, when we get freeze, we get cranky. What we're trying to do is nourish our ability to stay in our bodies while we do stuff. This is sound community development practice in terms of food security. It's resource, don't reduce. What does this look like pragmatically? A practice I do sometimes is sort of like capacity strength training, it's lifting. Every so often, but reasonably frequently. I'll ask people across my channels, who wants to do something good today? It'll only take 5 minutes. I explain what the action is, who any organizations involved are, warts and all. I give a précis of why this does that. Then I leave people to it. If they do it and report back, I say, thank you very much. And I do not immediately hit them up for anything else. I don't do it every day. I am more than available if they say, hey, I liked that, I'm interested in getting involved. I cheerfully invite them to bring friends. I'm offering an opportunity to build capacity, tools to select and define their sustainable practice. Change requires infrastructure. This is the big one. If you are asking people to jump away from an established behavior, something they already have in their drawer of priorities, are you offering them something to jump to? Or at least a chance with like some IKEA lumber and you can like Legos and you can pack something up. If not, how can you ask them to jump and expect a result? So what creates spaciousness around this question? And this is one of those places that abolitionist thinking really serves. A lot of my work is this bundle of little interventions for this reason, is because my practice for as an organizer is building infrastructure for a world I want to live in. Our political revolutions like to secure the train stations, the power plants. I'm growing a world here, so I need to build me some trains and some power plants that do the things we need done. So the practical takeaway here for climate infrastructure, some of this is physical, and there's a reason tool libraries and repair cafes and bike trains really pay off, they really work. But it's also worth considering widening what we consider climate communication into the kinds of interactive interventions you never breathe a word are an intervention, because that would ruin it. A really freaking good plant-based cookbook is climate infrastructure, because you've built a thing people can jump to without losses. Notice that's not telling anyone what to do. It's just making it really good to put in your mouth. That's fun. It's an invitation to play. So interventions like that, which meet a problem with available pleasure, are doing the work that Tony K. Bambara describes as making the revolution irresistible. Just put out the resource. You don't need to package in the moral. Offer the tool and keep our grubby little hands out of it. To blow out this concept a bit, what we're leading to is understanding sort of how to engage generously over this work in terms of how we share experience, other people's context, what we think is going on in other people's heads. The approach of building infrastructure for future worlds really does make you think in the long haul. And once you start doing that, you start thinking, all right, what kind of thing can we do that will not strain people so badly they leave or get tired? Where am I doing something that nourishes us, that builds infrastructure and not resource extraction? If I'm saying do this thing, it's good for us, you will feel good, but the story I carry and how I design my intervention in my body is logging, fracking, and mining people's needs, labor, and hearts, they're not going to be fooled by me. I'm not going to be fooled by me. So I want to build work that imagines ourselves in long-term, lifelong relations with our future colleagues. I've loved kind of spending this time like discussing how we build these better systems. And if I think I want to come down to one thing, it's that we are bodies, and around us, we generate a wake. The world comes into us. It also comes out of us in a very real and non-flaky way. If we want to live in new relations and to build new relations around us, it's really worth thinking about how we move to initiate and welcome them. And I think that's where the real value of thinking in play comes in. And this is where the difference in the process we did in reckoning that I described to you in such detail truly pays off. When I go into a situation walking generously in a play headspace, my goal is different from when I walk in from authority or when I walk in from need. I don't want people to comply, rescue, or submit in response. That's not the signal I'm given. I've taken those responses out of contention and frequently avoided a lot of arguments because people can tell I'm not scoping them out for what in them I can use. What I'm giving is I want someone to come play with me. I'm saying with my body and my approach that this is the invitation. And you get really interesting results on a structural level when you ask people to come play with you. When you communicate with everything, your body, your interaction, your affect, your assumptions, that you want this interaction to actually be good for everybody. So this is a quote from abolitionist organizer Mariame Kaba, who's the person to look for. It's possibly my favorite, but this bit especially. Building and trying and taking risks and understanding we're going to have tons of failure, and failure is actually the norm and a good way for us to learn lessons that help us. Another writer, a mentor a good deal older than me, made sure that a bunch of us knew going in that professional authors' acceptance rate is 1 in 10. 10%. If your acceptances, your sold pieces are 1/10 of your rejection letters, you are a pro. Professional baseball player hits about 200. It's the Mendoza line. They hit the ball 20% of the time. Professional. When we're willing to fail and iterate, and when we're kind to each other about it, we get this vital chance to learn and grow. We can do the analysis. We can be rigorous in figuring out why that thing in our mouth tasted like crap. We share our results, shake it off, and instead of licking it next time, we shove it up our nose. This can be fun, and this builds a certain quality of unenforced humility. And frankly, it makes us a lot nicer to play with. We're thinking differently about how we connect with people, not ways to persuade or defeat or avoid, but ways we can go Marco and generate Polo. And at this point in my practice, I sort of think about organizing as a perpetual learning position. When I am doing this well, my gait and balance are humility and curiosity. I am marking what I don't know yet, where it lives, what it connects to, how I might find out more, and what I can next lick. Body language communicates, structures communicate, elicitations communicate. These have results and implications, and at the center of all of them is kind of one question. Last question. To each other, to people we see it different or who we oppose, the outgroup, whatever. I'm not talking about being uncritical, but I am talking about basic trust. The most functional interventions can happen when you build real trust, and you can't force trust. It's a permaculture, you kind of have to tend it. And in a time of social betrayal, trust relations are grace, revelation, and power. So where I want to leave this off is encouraging everyone to think about what your practice looks like if you add trust and send out the signal to play. Do you play more? Do you play differently? And you play now? Does it take a certain fear out? How do you move? How might people respond to that difference in movement? What do you communicate when you make the active choice, the hope is a verb choice, to trust other people? And how does that change the emergency? Thank you so much for your time and attention in this extremely warm room.